The fear that everyone is going to get axed on day one is really just a myth in their heads. We're typically working with businesses where they're very lean, and for us, the people are the ones putting pavement into the ground. I'm not going to tell them how to put the concrete in the ground. We just want to make them smarter about the work they're doing and the returns they're getting on that work. The only times that I've been asked to let someone go is when a seller has a relative that's maybe not performing. Hey, we came in with a guillotine and the person's gone. I always get the sense that people think that when we show up, it's like I'm Darth Vader and the Imperial March is playing, in the background as we're like driving out there.
Welcome to M&A Talk, the #1 podcast on selling a business, brought to you by Morgan & Westfield, a boutique M&A firm specializing in the sale of small to mid-sized companies. I'm your host and president of Morgan & Westfield, Jacob Oros. If you're considering selling your business and you'd like to work with me throughout the process, you can schedule a free consultation at morganandwestfield.com. Or if you'd like my team and I to perform a valuation of your company for a one-time fee of $1,500, visit morganandwestfield.com or see the link in the show notes. Today, we're going to talk with Brandon Blewett. He's the head of corporate development at Pave America. Pave America is a $1 billion PE-backed paving company. And we're going to talk about life after the sale if you sell your company to a private equity firm. Not just life for you, but also life for your employees. A lot of times, obviously, there's a concern with your employees and others if you're selling your company to a PE firm, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. And Brandon, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be back.
So PE deal, now what? That's a concern. Everybody's seen the movies in the 80s, the articles, blah, 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 blah. Worried about selling to the a PE firm, and then the employees get worried. What's the bottom line here?
In our industry and in our particular roll-up, we're in hyper-growth mode. So the fear that everyone is going to get axed on day one is really just a myth in their heads. We're typically working with businesses where they're very lean, and for us, the people are the ones putting pavement into the ground, so they're the revenue generator. So I need them. So their jobs are probably more protected than even mine is.
Where does that come from? Is it the stories, probably not as much recently, but back in the day when PE firms would come in and buy a company that was being mismanaged, and one of the ways to turn it around was to reduce the staff? Do you think that's primarily where it came from?
I think it's that. And you still hear stories, if you go upstream, there's PE firms that have funds where they can go out and buy these, multi-billion-dollar businesses. You are going to have cost synergies when you get to a certain level. But I'd say the vast majority of, PE roll-ups, you're looking for growth, right? So I think there is still some element of that, but it's definitely not the vast majority of PE deals that I see on a regular basis.
Under what circumstances would you or might you cut some staff?
Yeah, I think it's where you have corporate function overlap, right? If you have
legal, HR.
Correct. Finance and accounting, things that you can pull into shared services, those would be areas where there might be overlap.
How would you address that? Would you, with the owner, would you say, okay, let's give those people some severance, let's help them? How would you address that?
I think there's a couple ways. If you are going to have that overlap, I think understanding very early on with the seller and mapping out a game plan of not only the things that you just outlined, the severance, if there's any type of retention agreement to get the institutional knowledge out of that particular person, but also the game plan, for the soft touch, because, what you don't want to do is, strike panic and fear that this is going to be something that's massive and it's going to cut deeper, because then what could happen is people start leaving in anticipation, and that can also put you in, a bit of a bind.
And I would imagine those types of stories, the boring stories where PE firm buys a company and nothing changes. I don't know why they'd end up in the news. Nothing happened.
Right. Right.
PE firm acquires
Yes.
ABC company and nothing happens. That would not be on the front page of the papers. With that being said, what changes are there? What are some of the biggest changes?
I think that the biggest changes when you have institutional capital and you're looking for scale are things that were going to change if your company continued to grow at a pace where you wanted visibility. So, your finance and accounting system, you're probably going to get something that's a little more robust. Your CRM, it's probably not going to be on a notepad or just something you track, in Excel. You're going to have, some tools around that. Your expense management, look, there's a lot of honor code stuff that you can do, and it's a small business. But when you have institutional capital behind you and you have lenders and sponsors, they just want to make sure that there's, integrity and verification and expense management. So I think it's these systems and processes that, look, for someone like me that's worked in consulting and, now in my role, I don't view them as, moving from Concur to Ramp to me is not that difficult to make that switch. When you take something that's super manual and then you have a system and a process and a, standard operating procedure that's built around it, it can seem, very disruptive. So I think understanding those clearly and having the seller be a cheerleader and communicate that to, the second and third chair folks that it's really going to be impacting day to day is really important.
What size companies are you typically acquiring?
I'm going to use the old annoying consulting answer and say it depends because it does vary, right? And it varies based on what the goal is. If I'm going into a new market, right, we're planning a new flagpole, I want something of size and scale, right? So for us, call it that 25 to, 50 million plus business is something that, hey, we're going to go into a new market. If it's, reinforcing presence in a market where we already have a location or it's adding a service line, I can go much smaller, right? Because you have an existing legal entity, it's going to be a little bit easier to integrate. And so I don't feel like I lose the time value, the effort level of getting that deal tucked in is not going to be something that it's like, well, I might as well have gone and chased something that was, a bit meatier, like I would in a new geographic location.
So you'd call it maybe what, 2 to 50 million, 2 to 100 million, 5 to 100 million?
Yeah.
And all in the paving sector, right?
Yeah. Paving, laying down asphalt and concrete, pavement marking, so striping, seal coating, and just other routine maintenance that's associated with, parking lots and roads.
Now, what might the difference be between, say, a company in your industry being acquired by a PE firm like yourself versus, say, a strategic? Because there's probably some downsides to selling to a strategic as well.
Right. And I would say that when we go out and partner with businesses and acquire them, we are PE backed, but it probably is more akin to being acquired by a strategic because we will have the owners roll forward, equity into the platform that's offered to a lot of their, key employees as well. But they do have a boss, right? There's a regional president, there's a COO, there's, my boss, Tom, the CEO, that, will be giving them the directives. If they sell directly to a fund, well, you're now probably the CEO and president, and you're reporting directly to the private equity investors. What's nice about that is you may have a richer exit, right, when there's an eventual trade, but the responsibilities that you're going to be asked to undertake are going to be much greater. And if a PE firm is acquiring you, they are going to want you to grow. So I would be worried like, okay, I'm used to managing this, 25 million, top line business. What happens? Like, am I ready for the responsibilities when this is a, 100, 200 million, top line platform? So there's just a lot of different things to think about. I think there's pros and cons to both.
What is your toolkit, if you will, your private equity toolkit? What tools do you use to typically improve a company and optimize it?
I think for us, it's data visibility and getting very structured around how we bid the work that we do and bidding it with a tool that allows us to see margin, right up front. So I think what that really helps is whether it's the sales team or the estimators, they're able to quickly delineate between what's a good project and what maybe is not a good project so that when monthly financials are being reported, there's not shock that, oh, we're having a bad month, right? A lot of these businesses, they do really well, but if you were to ask them on a month over month basis, can you tell me that the health, they're going to find out, retroactively, whereas we have the ability to help them better predict, going into the bidding process. And I think that's where we've seen, the greatest improvement, because I'm not a paver. Our CEO is not a paver. I'm not going to tell them how to put the concrete in the ground. We just want to make them smarter about the work they're doing and the returns they're getting on that work.
What does your plan look like? Your 90-day, 180-day plan, whatever you might call that. after you've closed? A lot of PE firms have a 90-day plan or 180-day plan. What does yours look like?
We start with just brass tacks integration, right? We want to make sure that they're on NetSuite, which is our accounting system. We want to make sure they're into PaymentSoft, which is our bidding and estimating tool. Also, we have a lot of safety processes and systems that we work to help manage everything from cameras and trucks, so that if there's an accident, we have video proof. If things were to go to court or there's an insurance claim, as well as understanding what's the maintenance requirements in life of our equipment, so we know when it's time to just discard something. And then payroll, benefits, all of that. So what we do is we stagger all of those items over the first 90 days. So we'll typically lead with finance and accounting, just because that is something that we need to have from a reporting perspective very quickly. And it's also generally the least disruptive to the actual business, because it's a corporate function that's somewhat in a silo. And same thing with HR, right? Like, that's something that I can generally do pretty quickly. We will try to time HR to where there's no deductible resets, so people aren't having to, spend again on their deductible. So we generally have some flexibility there, but from a payroll perspective, we like to get, people moved over, fairly quickly. And then from there, it really depends on the time of year. If it's peak busy season, like I said, our CRM tool and estimating tool is very critical, but there's some heavy lifting. There's data inputs, and then there's training on usage of the tool, all the way down to your foreman. And so if it's summer and you're a business in, say, Wisconsin or Massachusetts, where you can only lay asphalt, 6 months of the year, I'm probably going to wait until it's slow season for that system to come into place. But then after finance and HR, if we can't do PaymentSoft, the safety stuff is running in parallel, just because a lot of that stuff, it matters, right? We diligence to make sure that people are operating safely, but we just want to make sure that we have that documented and institutionalized in a formal capacity, so that we're not getting calls and hearing about incidents that would be very unfortunate.
How do you handle those conversations if you do have to lay off some staff in HR, finance, legal, and so forth?
I'll be very honest. With our roll-up, we have not had to do any cost overlay synergies. The only times that I've been asked to let someone go is when a seller has a relative that's maybe not performing, and they want to use, us or the PE as the fall person for the reason that they're no longer with the business. And I think that the way that we go about it is you look for the way that's going to be the least confrontational, and it's going to create the least amount of, the least amount of ripple effect within the organization. So there's typically severance involved. You make sure you handle it in a way that's, the person doesn't feel like they're not dignified, or someone's just out to chase them. And generally speaking, there's some kind of transition period so that the person can go out over a period of time. It's not just something that's, hey, we came in with a guillotine and the person's gone.
Why aren't you shooting for cost synergies?
Well, for us right now, we're just looking to expand our geographic presence. So as we continue to go out west or look for new markets, I just don't have the heads. And a lot of what we do, the relationships are managed at a very, local level. So our corporate HQ at, Pave America is actually really lean when you think about the fact that we're $1 billion enterprise.
What are your goals in the first X number of months or years, and how do those change as the transition goes on?
I mean, my first goals are to get them integrated and using our systems and processes to where they understand it. That's, call it the first 6 months, right? After that 6 months, my goal and what we go through in our value creation plans is, okay, here's where you are today. Let's create an outlook of here's where we want you to be in year 1, and here's where we want you to be in year 2. And then what we do is we understand what are the CapEx requirements to get there, what are the hiring needs, because if we're going to grow, you're going to need, additional crews. And do we have the backlog and the sales function to be able to, go out and execute that growth plan intelligently? And we're PE back. So we all have a 3 to 5 year, window, right? And so the goal is, okay, how do we make sure that you're locked in and you're integrated, and then you're using the processes and the scale that we have to continue that growth path, so that in 3 to 5 years, when we exit again, it's a very lucrative and beneficial exit for everyone that's at the business.
And let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. And when we come back, let's actually discuss some of the employees' concerns, some of the sellers' concerns. A lot of times the sellers are very concerned about telling their employees that they are selling to a PE firm. So we'll take a quick break. And then when we come back, we'll discuss those topics. If you're a regular listener of M&A Talk, you know the secret to successfully selling your business is preparation. Whether you want to sell your business now or sometime in the future, my team and I can help ensure you're as prepared as possible. We can perform an assessment of your company, which includes a valuation of your business, a review of how easy your business will be to sell, a summary of deal killers that can derail your sale, a list of things you can do to maximize value, and insight into how buyers will perceive your business in the actual marketplace. The assessment has a one-time fee of $1,500 with no commitments and a 10-day turnaround time. To get started, visit morganandwestfield.com or see the link in the show notes. Now back to today's show. Welcome back to M&A Talk with Brandon Blewett. And Brandon, what are some of the seller's concerns as you're going through the diligence process and as the seller's realizing that I'm going to have to tell my employees that we are being acquired by a private equity firm? What are their concerns usually at that point?
Their concerns are generally that the employees are going to react negatively to the news. And, there's the view that they sold out, right? And that everything is going to change. And that's not the case. There are some things that will change. Anyone that tells a seller otherwise is, lying. But I think that their concern is that they've got this very loyal employee base. A lot of times the employees look to this person as more than just a boss. It's almost like, a mother or father figure, to them. And I think they're worried that the sale is going to let them down in some personal capacity.
How does that usually play out?
I think there's two ways. One, we generally try to coach owners that, hey, it's best to bring in some people early on in the process. One, that helps alleviate the burden of all the diligence requests that are, going to be quite fulsome and almost seem overly invasive during that process. But I think you also, when you bring people in early, they get to see the buy-in and why the partnership makes sense. And it gives you a little more time to walk through why some of the changes that are made are necessary. And I'll always, talk with owners and say, look, like you built this business to, $30 million, right? If you want to take this thing to 60 to 75 on your own, like you could do that. But there was going to be a lot of process and systematic changes that were going to have to take place, whether or not you sold. And so I think when the seller can communicate that to employees, that we were going to have to go to we were probably going to have to move out of QuickBooks. We were probably going to have to get a CRM tool, all those things that we were talking about earlier, that those are all just necessary, whether or not there's, a buyer involved for you to grow the business. I think that does help alleviate some of the, the pain points, or at least the fear factor.
Now, what about when the employees do find out? How do they usually react?
It varies. I've had some where, they freak out, right? I mean, I get it. It's a lot of change. And I think that the things that we talked about at the outset, the fear, I'm going to lose my job, that's just something that creeps in. And, they feel like the person that they've known and trusted is no longer the person that is in charge of the whole ship. And so there's just a lot of concerns. But I've also found that what we try to do is make it a celebratory event with the seller. So we go on site, there's swag, we talk about the partnership. We're very intentional that we're talking about the growth goals, that they're all involved. Tom, our CEO, is, always present at these events so that even if they still have some questions and concerns, we have like FAQ documents, right, that explain the business, what will the transition look like? To me, the more transparent you can be and friendly and understanding of those questions and not, shy from answering them, the better it tends to go.
What's the upside for employees for your deals?
For us, a lot of times it's something as simple as we're 2,500 people. So our health and welfare benefits are, much richer than something a small business, can afford to give. Another thing is, look, we're a national platform. And, if someone's spouse gets transferred from, say, Atlanta to, Dallas, Texas, they can transfer internally, right? And then as it relates to, equity, we have a we put together packages where people at the foreman level are able to participate in, different, share classes so that, when there is an eventual trade or sale, that's a meaningful monetary, event. So there's a lot more just employee upside that comes with being part of a larger platform.
What do you think is the most difficult part of the whole transition process for the employees?
I think it can be two things. I think one, depending on how manual the business is, I just think anytime, you're having to learn, a new system, a new process, if you're going from writing things on, notepads to having to input things on an iPad, for the system to, populate that request, that's going to be a little bit painful. And I think that's why we try to be careful with how we stage all of those things. Because, in a big company, like say a GE deal, right, there's multiple heads handling each function in silos, right? You've got your HR department, your finance department, your sales, et cetera. We oftentimes find that one person is wearing, 3 or 4 hats. And so I can, in theory, say, well, HR is going to change on this day and then finance is going to change on this day. But if it's the same person that's having to go through both of those changes, that can seem like a lot and be overwhelming for those employees.
What's the most difficult part of the whole transition and integration process for you?
I think the most difficult part for me is understanding when they are not just hooked up to the system, but ensuring that they know how to use it properly, right? And I don't think that there's ever any malintent, but I think there's this, I don't want to mess things up or admit that I don't know what I'm doing. And so I think having a very, rigorous training mechanism is really important, because you can have everybody in the right system, but if they're not using it correctly, then, the data you get at the end of the month is going to be garbage and you're not going to be able to use it. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge.
How do you usually handle the transition in leadership? If the seller doesn't stick around, how do you handle that?
We're a little bit unique in that I typically don't look for businesses where the owner is looking to skedaddle on day one. The only opportunities like that we would pursue would be, we have a business in a location, it's of size and scale. There's this, tuck in that we can, bolt on.
So you have a leader in that.
Right. We already have a leader in place. Now, we do succession planning because there are businesses where the seller only wants to stay on for, another year or two. And so what we will do is identify someone internally that they have. And if that's the case, then we'll go through a, grooming process to make sure that they're ready to take over the business, in the next year or two. And then if there's not someone already identified internally, we've looked elsewhere in our platform and said, hey, look, you're sitting in the, second or third chair and
move to Atlanta and
right.
You gotta.
Exactly.
How risky is that for you to find a new leader?
It's always risky, right? I mean, I think in any business where there's such a pivotal relationship between, the leadership and, the work that's being done on a daily basis, that's critical. So I think that's why we do so much vetting and why we also like internal referrals, because you have to have credibility that you understand the work that's being done on a daily basis. Like, it's easy for me to sit in an M&A lead and, know cursory details about paving, but to actually understand like the pain points, why the estimators have an issue, why, crews are having, particular issues are having, like, you got to know that, in depth. And so it is critical. And I think that's why we've got such a, thorough vetting process when we, look to replace talent when it exits.
What are the most positive changes that occur as a result of the acquisition?
Well, I think the flexibility, if they want to move or a spouse gets a job somewhere else and they're able to move, I think that's huge. And I think there's the stability of, you're working for an organization where if one particular branch has a down year, maybe because of weather or other factors, you've got a whole, army of other businesses behind you that, are probably going to even that out. And so you're, what is personal collateral on the line with a business owner is now, shared responsibility across an entire platform. So I think there's greater job security, there's greater flexibility. And then, we have more formal, PTO policies and holidays and, benefits for the employees that I think there's a sense of stability that is great for the mindset.
How do you typically handle disclosing to the employees about the sale?
We usually leave that up to the owner. I will encourage them to bring in, call it their, 2 or 3 folks during the process. And then every owner's a little bit different. There's some that once, they felt like the diligence process was complete from hey, we've uncovered everything we need to uncover. We're on a glide path to close. They wanted to give the employees some kind of, prep that there was going to be news. I've had other owners that don't want to say anything until the closing date and we have, a party or an event. I've had sellers that want to let employees know first by themselves, and we make sure that the FAQ documents are there. I don't typically like that just because I think they get a lot of questions that they don't know the answers to, and it's better if someone from the organization is there.
That's a really good point. Such as, you have an example?
Well, I mean, they'll ask about their company vehicles, their, phone policies and stuff that I already understand is, look, it's baked into the P&L, right? That's how we value the business. They're not thinking that way. And so they get trapped. Or I've requested this, PTO. Am I still allowed to take it? We're not going to come in and take anyone's, PTO away, right? And understanding what the balance will be, when they come onto our platform. So there's just a lot of little nuance things, credit cards, what's that transition going to look like? And I think you can get caught flat footed. Whereas we have documents that outline all that and have, the people that can be there to answer, all those questions.
Is there kind of this fear of this big 800-pound gorilla is going to come in and just start slashing around and firing people and imposing unreasonable policies? Is that kind of the general initially, and then you're like, hey, look, we're not the bad guys.
I always get the sense that people think that when we show up, it's I'm Darth Vader and the Imperial March is playing, in the background as we're driving out there.
No personality, no feelings.
Yeah, exactly.
None of that. Yep.
Yeah. What I always find hilarious is if you really think that we at the corporate level could do your job on a daily basis, you clearly haven't seen us, right? There's no way that we could go do that, do the hard work that they're doing every day. And so to me, that's why that is sort of it's what's in the headline. So people are, it's completely reasonable to have, those fears. And I think that's why we try to be there and be as transparent and communicate, as much as we can. And I'm not saying that it diffuses that notion day one, but we have to be patient. And I think that when you're not critical of people having that opinion and you take it and you answer the questions, you let them ask it in whatever manner or tone they want to, and you just come back reasonable, you'll win people over if you're doing things right.
What kind of synergies are there?
For us, I'd say the biggest synergies are really around commercial insurance, right? We as a platform have a lot better, better rates, same thing with bonding, health and welfare benefits. We're able to provide a lot richer plans, a much, lower cost, generally speaking. Now, sometimes per person, the cost goes down, but because the benefits are much richer, you have more employee participation. So that one's a little bit harder to bake into, evaluation, but those are typically where I see the biggest synergies. And then, look, we have, 2,500 employees. We're $1 billion revenue with, CapEx vendors and suppliers. We have a lot of volume as a platform. So a lot of times we're able to get, equipment, tools, and, asphalt itself, and other materials that they need to lay down asphalt, do the maintenance work at a better price point.
What do you think that results in from a margin standpoint? It just EBITDA go up 10%, 20%. How would you quantify that? We target, 12 to 15% EBITDA growth, per year. And what we're generally looking at, we typically look at businesses that are anywhere from, call it 10 to 20% EBITDA margin. Obviously, there's going to be some that are north of that if they're, doing work that's more specialized or, say for a utility company. But what we have done is, with our PavementSoft tool and the way that we get the estimators and the sales force smart around bidding, we're trying only to, price things so that we're hitting that 15 to 20%, margin. So I think a lot of it is really just understanding how to bid the work. And then there's some projects and there's some companies where you're going to have to go lower, but making sure that you're balancing that so that the overall blend is at a higher rate. And then there's also things, certain markets dictate what your margins are going to be. Expecting, crazy high margins in markets where things are more, price sensitive is not realistic. And then there's, other markets or customer bases where you can make up that ground. So what's the truth here? Are you lying to me?
No,
should I
never.
listen to Hollywood? What are you not telling us here?
No, I think that the biggest pain point that you'll see is just, it's probably the level of reporting and detail you have to provide, on a regular basis that people just aren't accustomed to, and then constantly answering those questions.
Well, what's the takeaway as we wrap up this conversation?
I think that if you're looking to sell your business and you want to sell to private equity, it's just understanding what are the process and system changes that are going to take place, and just realizing that if your goal was to grow your business, and double it in the next 2 or 3 years, you were going to have to do a lot of those, on your own to get it to that level. So it's really a matter of working with your people and helping them understand that, so that the transition into the new relationship is, as smooth as possible, and just understanding there's going to be some change, but that's just part of growing pains of any business, regardless of the ownership structure.
Let's plug your firm here, your company. What's the name of your company and what type of targets are you looking for?
Absolutely. So Pave America, we're $1 billion top line, and what we do is pavement maintenance work. So whether that's asphalt or concrete, we're doing the milling and the paving, we're marking it up, we're doing seal coating, we're doing patchwork, and we work across both commercial and municipal clients. And look, it's a lot of fun. I've gotten to meet some really awesome people and see some really great business owners, and it makes the job fun.
Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That's Brandon Blewett. Brandon, thanks again for joining us on the show, and thank you for listening.
M&A Talk is brought to you by Morgan & Westfield, a nationwide leader in mergers and acquisitions for small to mid-market companies. If you've enjoyed this show, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. Learn more at morganandwestfield.com. While we take reasonable care to select recognized experts for our podcast, please note that each podcast presents the independent opinions of such experts only, and not of Morgan & Westfield. We make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information provided. Any reliance on the podcast information is at your own risk. The podcast is for general information only and cannot be considered legal or professional advice.